We're so glad that you're here this morning. Jake and I, ever so often, we team teach, and it's always a little interesting. And then today, with us team teaching on love, romantic love, there's a part of this morning that we don't even know what the other person is saying. So if you see me giving him the stink eye at any point, you know what's going on. It's new to me. But we are really excited to just talk to you about a subject that's so important to a lot of us. Who doesn't love a good story, a love story? We all, yeah.
Not true.
Guys, I know you love a good love story too. Like a good love story is, I remember the first time I watched Anne of Green Gables. I wasn't going to watch the movie, and a couple of my friends in college were. And if you don't know Anne of Green Gables, it's this beautiful love story that spans decades. And I stayed up all night, trying to watch these two get together. So it's easy to lose ourselves in a good love story. But it goes deeper than that, right? It's not a Hallmark movie. From humanity's earliest days, love, Eros, romantic love has been a deep longing for human hearts. So I know there's ancient love stories, so I Googled what is the oldest surviving love poem. And I don't know what I thought, but I was surprised what I found. The oldest one was from a bride to her groom, Sumerians, and this was something she sang or said to him on their wedding day, and he was the Sumerian king. And it was between 2037 and 2029 BC. That's an old poem. That's an old love poem. And I'm going to tell you the start of it. Okay, you ready? This is really romantic. So if you need romantic words for your partner, this is it. Okay, you ready?
I am ready.
Okay, it's to you.
Thank you.
Bridegroom, dear.
Just to be clear, we're not this old.
Yeah. Okay, here we go. Bridegroom, dear to my heart, goodly is your beauty, honey sweet.
Thank you.
Lion, dear to my heart, goodly is your beauty, honey sweet. That's the start of the poem. I'm not really sure what she's saying, but that was a love poem written a long, long time ago. And romantic, like I've been saying, romantic love has been a big deal for a long time. So then I thought, well, what is a way to kind of gauge romantic love, Eros, for today, modern times? So I Googled what the revenue was for online dating apps for the year 2022. $8 billion. $8 billion.
Billion with a B.
That's a lot of money to pay for love. But you know what? The price, for any of us who've longed for that, there is no price that's too high. Research suggests that falling in love can feel like a dose of cocaine. Our brain chemistry literally changes when we fall in love. So love's a big deal.
Yes.
Yeah. So our love story, I know that any of you who have heard our love story have either heard my version or his version. And we've made a conclusion about the difference between these two versions. Yeah, the translation part.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Well, also, to be fair, you've never heard my story, my version uninterrupted. There's always color commentary. So, but I love you.
I know. So Jake said
Goodly,
that
sweet.
if you were going to compare the versions of our love stories to different Bible translations, mine would be the amplified message version, and his would be like the basic...
Like the Greek fragment version.
Yeah. And so we have different versions of the same story. And a part of it is because we were two different people coming into this one story together. And so it meant different things. For me, Jake was my first boyfriend. And for years, since I was a young girl, I think my first crush was David Hasselhoff when he was in Knight Rider. And that started a long line of crushes. And then I get into junior high, and Ricky Ropp was like, he was this great guy, and he knew sign language. It was so cool in my middle school. And one day, you guys, hold on, he said this to me.
Oh, whoa.
He told me in sign language that he loved me. I was just blown away. But you know, that was about the extent of my love life before Jake came on the scene. And by the time Jake came on the scene, I was 22, and I was trying to really nail down what it was I was looking for in love. And has anyone seen the movie Jerry Maguire in here? And there's this part where he walks in and he says to her, "You complete me." And I remember when I saw that, I'm like, yes, this is it. He's completed because of her. How beautiful is that? And I realized that when I was younger, that's what I was looking for. I was looking for someone to complete me. I was looking for someone to adore me, someone to think I was just the best. And I think I'm going to talk about this more, but I don't think those were bad things, because I think actually those are things that God's placed in us that we do need. And we're going to get a little further on, we're going to get to how those needs can be met. How was it for you?
So she was looking for some
honey sweet.
lion, as I expect to be referred to from now on. I'm going to get boos for this. I wasn't looking for love. Boo. But I'm so glad I found it.
Yes.
Thank you. There we go. And that's how you do it, fellas. I wasn't. I had dated, and it was our senior year. We were good friends, and then it was, I think, a surprise, initially a disappointment, then a fear, then an excitement that our relationship changed, and we came to a point where we felt like we're either going to see this through or kind of start saying goodbye, and that was a surprise to me, to both of us, but for me, I just wasn't anticipating that, and then I lucked out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Jake and I, we did dating really fast. We got married really fast. And one of the things, too, about us is we were completely opposites. Our friends were a little concerned when we got together. Didn't make sense to them.
I got a lot of threats.
Yeah.
She didn't.
Yeah.
Seems
Yeah.
harsh.
But I think sometimes I look back and I think, wow, I can't believe we actually got together. We were just so different.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes God uses our ignorance to get us right where we need to be. And that's the thing about love. It doesn't always make sense on paper. I think we look at things and we want it to line up in such a perfect way. And yet love just doesn't. It's supernatural. It's beyond our human thinking. And so we've talked about different kinds of love. All this month we've been discussing loves. The first week was storge love. That was something I talked about. We talked that's a love that you often share with family and close friends. It's a familiar love. It's people that we share life with where we feel that love. And the bonds of this storge love include loyalty, affection, commitment to witness and share life together. And when we talk about our church family, sometimes when we talk about us being a family, we're talking about that element of storge love between us. But storge love is beautiful. You know, we talked about how God made it so that we as humans can have connections with animals, like our pets that we love. And so when Jake thinks of Boo, you know, he's feeling storge love, right?
So much storge.
Not so much. Boo is our dog. But it's this beautiful thing that transcends age or class. It's just a connection. It's spending time together. And that's what makes it possible for people like Jake and I, who are very different, to share a bond. And often storge love lends itself to eros, which is romantic love, which is what we're talking about today.
Yeah, excuse me. And then last week, I talked about phileo. One thing you'll see is we try to define these. These are Greek words, 4 different kinds of love. Greek has 4 different words for love to kind of get at the different kinds of relationships we have. But you'll also sometimes feel like the definitions overlap a little bit. To me, it's a little bit like when you go to pick out just the perfect color of white, at Home Depot, and you're like, white's white, right? And then you get there and there's 100 whites, and then you're dizzy with which one. To me, it's like, I don't care, because I'm going to put it on the wall, but just pick it out. But they all look the same, so there's some overlap. They're white family. Storge they're all similar, but there's some differences. Phileo, we talked about last week, is really an appreciation for the other. And the one example, we'll talk about another verse I shared last week, but the example I used was, the story I used was Jesus and Lazarus. Jesus and Lazarus had a close relationship, and it's very possible that in John, when it refers to the disciple whom Jesus loved, it was actually Lazarus, because that's when that phrase comes into the story, is when Lazarus gets sick and then dies. Jesus goes and enters into, he feels the pain for the people who grieve Lazarus' death. He goes to help Lazarus, and he's moved by that. He just enjoys Lazarus. So there's this appreciation for the other that phileo tries to capture.
Yeah. And like storge, phileo can lend itself then to become eros. It can become a romantic love. And for Jake and I, that was our story. We were friends for a long time. Mm-hmm. We shared storge love, phileo love, and then eventually we stepped into eros. And so a definition, like Jake said, we'd like to define things, because I grew up in church and it was a beautiful experience, but even growing up in church, there were so many words that were said that I didn't understand. I was like, I don't know what that means. And people would say it and like mic drop. And I'm like, I don't know what that means. Right. And so even these are these Greek words are biblical concepts in the Bible. And so the definition of eros, again, how does one describe love? Many of us, we know what it feels like, right? We know what it feels like to have those butterflies and that feeling. But it really is being drawn to a specific person and losing ourselves to it. As we've mentioned the past couple weeks, we've talked about C.S. Lewis and his book, The Four Loves. Mm. In his book, Lewis refers to eros as the feeling between two people, and Venus as the sexual component to those feelings. So we're going to talk just about sex for a minute. It's not going to get uncomfortable, I promise. But eros is affectionate love that is possessive and intimate. It is far more inclusive than just sexual love. Theologian Anders Nygren says that eros bases its interest in the single other instead of all the others. So eros makes us desire one specific person. If you're feeling desire for more than one specific person, that's not love. That's not eros. Real eros, real love, also makes us want the best for that specific person, not just the pleasure that they can give. If you read his book, you would find that Lewis, and again, I recommend this book highly, thinks that we make the part of sexual love, the Venus aspect of love, as the goal, instead of it being a symbol of a deeper attachment between two people. Quoting Lewis from his book, The Four Loves, he said, and if you've read any of his books, he's got a great sense of humor and wit, and he just says, we take sex way too seriously, basically. He says, I believe we are all being encouraged to take Venus, again, that's the sexual component of love, too seriously, at any rate, with the wrong kind of seriousness. All my life, a ludicrous and portentous solemnization of sex has been going on. And this was written quite a while ago. And we can see, even in our modern day love stories, that they portray that love is ultimately expressed through physical intimacy. But what our hearts are longing for is so much more than those experiences. So we're going to take some time. Jake's going to talk a little bit from the New Testament. I'm going to talk a little bit from the Old Testament. But love
Which fits, because you love the Old Testament a lot more
I
than
know,
I do. And
I know. I
so
do
it's
love
good.
the Old Testament. So, love stories in the Bible. You know what? It's hard to find a good one.
Right,
Like,
it is.
there's no simple love stories in the Bible,
Yeah.
which is probably true of most of humanity. But all the stories in the Bible are really complicated. There is not a Hallmark movie in one of them. So today we're going to look at the story, just briefly, of Jacob and Rachel. And if I had to find a modern telling of this story, it would probably look more like Sister Wives. Shout out for you, Haley. Don't worry. Haley does a podcast on Sister Wives.
She's not a polygamist.
Yeah. And if you don't know, Sister Wives is a television series about a polygamous family. And so
We're so good at this.
we are.
Can you believe we practice?
So in this story of Jacob and Rachel, we find deception, jealousy, and then the big one, polygamy. And one of the things, just talking with Haley about her podcast and being curious about it, we actually met when we were in Utah this past summer. Our group that went for Big Kick soccer camp, we actually had an opportunity to hear a couple of men speak who grew up in polygamous homes and who also, they went out to ice cream with us. And it was so interesting just hearing their personal reflections. And basically, it just doesn't work. I think that's kind of what the show is revealing, but also talking to these gentlemen, it just doesn't work. It's not what God planned. Yet, God has always used our imperfect stories to glorify himself. And so God's design has always been for exclusive and mutual loving relationships. But as a result of the time, he was going to use one, imperfect as it was. And he really, if you know the Old Testament, you know that he used Jacob and Rachel mightily. And so we're just going to get to the part of their story of them finding each other and coming one. So this guy named Jacob had stolen his brother's inheritance. And he was like a bad dude. Like if you read this, you're like, buddy. Like him and his mom were always like conniving and just trying to manipulate things. So Jacob, well, really it was his mother, came up with this idea, you're going to steal your brother's blessing. And so his brother finds this out, and he's furious. He's just furious. This was a very big deal at that time. And so Jacob's brother vowed to kill him. And so at the direction of his mom, again, mom's in this, and she's like, okay, your brother now wants to kill you, so you need to run. And so mom said, hey, this is what you're going to do. You're going to go to your uncle Laban. And actually, he has these daughters, marry one of his daughters. Yes, we realize these are cousins, but this was a normal cultural thing at the time. And she said, be fruitful, buy some land, have a good life. So Jacob runs. And all this story can be found in Genesis 29. And we'll read some scripture here in a little bit. But so he's running, and he ends up at this well. And by a stroke of luck, guess who's there? His cousin, Rachel. Oh, it's almost like a Hallmark movie. Yeah. It really feels like a Hallmark movie up until this point. So he meets her at the well, and Jacob ends up going, she's a shepherdess, and he ends up going home with her, meets his uncle Laban, and Jacob starts working for his uncle, and then soon Jacob falls madly in love with Rachel. And one thing the Bible does tell us is that she was kind of haughty, like she was beautiful. And so Jacob falls in love with Rachel, and then they married and lived happily ever after.
Yep.
Do you think that's how the story ends? No, it doesn't end that way. That would be the Hallmark version. The real story is Jacob approaches Laban, his uncle, and he says, hey, I love your daughter. Can I have her hand in marriage? And Laban, being the smart businessman that he is, says, hey, how about this? You work for me 7 years, and then you can have her hand in marriage. And Rachel, she wasn't the only one in the house. Rachel had an older sister named Leah. And it wasn't common for the younger sister to get married before the older sister, but Laban agreed to this. He said, okay, work 7 years, and you can have her. And so Jacob works 7 years, and eventually that 7 years is up, and he goes to Laban, his uncle, and says, okay, it's time. And so Laban says, okay, you've done your 7 years. And we're going to start Genesis 29, verse 22. So Laban brought together all the people of the place and gave a feast. So this is a wedding feast. They're celebrating this union between Rachel and Jacob. But when evening came, he took his daughter Leah, that's not Rachel, Leah, and brought her to Jacob, and Jacob made love to her. So this was a really sneaky thing for Uncle Laban to do. So Jacob, thinking that he married Rachel, actually married Leah. When morning came, there was Leah. Poor Leah. I feel bad for Leah in this story. So Jacob said to Laban, what is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me? Laban replied, it is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. Finish this daughter's bridal week, then we will give you the younger one also in return for another 7 years of work. I kind of don't even know what to say about all that. That's a lot of work. Would you have worked for me 14 years?
Yes.
I don't know if I believe that, but yeah, so poor Leah in all this. And this story gets very twisty if you keep reading, and we're not going to go into that today. But again, God does work through these people. And Laban giving Jacob another chance, work another 7 years. I kind of wonder, a lot of times when I'm reading the Bible, I try to put myself in that situation. Like, was he like, okay, give me 24 hours to think about it? Like, when do I need to get back to you on this? Or was he just like, no? And Scripture tells us he actually said yes. In Genesis 29:28, it says, and Jacob did so. Right away. He just was like, yes, I will do anything for Rachel. No price was too high for Jacob. No price was too high for that kind of eros, for that kind of love. His beloved Rachel was worth it. His beloved was worth any sacrifice.
All right. So as Michelle said, there's a lot to talk about. This is not a pro-polygamy church. There's a lot of complexities there that are cultural. We can get into that another day. So we chose not to kind of cover all that stuff and really just the love story between Jacob and Rachel. But you can see there's some cultural and some family stuff going on that makes it a harder story. We're going to fast forward a couple thousand years to the New Testament and to Ephesians 5. And Ephesians 5 is one of those passages that has, I think, created a lot of hurt in people and relationships and caused some confusion. And so we're going to clear all that up, centuries of confusion. I'm going to set straight today, and then we can move on. So I'm going to remember this is the Bible. So when I read it, don't throw anything at me. It's not, if you're mad about it, you don't like it, whatever. This is the Bible. Let's talk about it. Ephesians 5:22 through 33. I'm going to read this whole passage because I think the whole thing is important. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So there's a lot there, right? There's some words there that we can have reactions to. A few years ago, when we were still in Minneapolis at our parent church, I was leading a Wednesday night kind of adult Bible study. We were going through Ephesians, and wouldn't you know it, I was sick on the day it was covered. We were to cover this passage, so our lead pastor had to cover it, and he was unhappy with me. But it's a complicated passage. It starts off with, it's pretty strong, wives, submit to your own husbands. So before you freak out, let me just kind of give some background about Ephesians. One, it probably wasn't addressed specifically to Ephesus. It's more of the oldest copies don't have Ephesians in the title. It's more of a letter that was to an area, was probably routed to a collection of churches. It doesn't seem to address any one specific problem like a lot of Paul's letters do, where he's calling out specific people or even acknowledging, you asked this question, here's my answer, that kind of thing. So it's just kind of a general letter. Here's how the church should operate. So he's addressing that kind of thing. But in this area, there was a very strong following of a goddess. There was a goddess cult. And so there were priestesses that had become Christians. And so as Paul's addressing this, one of his issues is these women were used to being in religious leadership, and so now they're stepping in very quickly into leadership within the church, and yet they really don't know much about Jesus. And so it's creating some problems. So some of his language about women should be quiet, that kind of thing, if you read the whole story, he goes back and forth. He's really saying, I think, addressing specific cultural issues. For the time being, let's remember that we need to be discipled into Christ before we start leading people. And so he's addressing that a little bit. So it sounds like control, but it's really about discipling people. Note that in this passage, even though this passage starts with wives submit, he actually has a lot more to say to men. And I think men skip over that. They read this and they're like, submit, right? And then they just kind of don't acknowledge the rest of it, which is a pretty strong challenge for men. And we get that from Adam. That is in us. It's not my fault, it's hers. It's not her fault, it's yours, Lord. Like that's in us, man, is to like push that. And then when that is, then just saying it isn't enough, we kind of use other ways to subdue or control women so that we don't feel at fault. Right? And so if you look throughout the world, I think many of our problems are because of misuse of power, misunderstanding of power or rank. So we have to acknowledge that maybe it starts in this way, we're like, ha, submit, and then we read on like, oh, you want me to do what Jesus did. Great, he's the BMOC. Oh, wait a minute, Jesus, what? He died for the church. He gave everything for the church. He deferred to the church himself. That's a pretty high charge, right? That's a pretty high calling. So dudes, Paul's saying, like, you have a lot of responsibility, and so just remember that, and let me talk about this at length. So he's giving a high charge. In another letter, Paul to the Galatians, I love Galatians, we all know this, that's what we're talking about, very slowly through the men's Bible study, Paul states there's neither male nor female, etc. That in the kingdom, it's not that being male or female isn't significant or special or good or part of God's revelation or all that, but in the kingdom, there isn't rank, is what he's getting at. You might have societal rank that out in Roman culture, men might outrank women, and they did. Rich people would outrank poor people. Non-Christians would outrank Christians, all that stuff. But inside these doors, in these walls, in the kingdom, where 2 or 3 or more are gathered in my name, there is no rank. That's what he's getting at. So when we go to this letter to the Ephesians, to those churches, we see that Paul is not saying husbands outrank wives. He's presenting this challenge to submit mutually in different language, and in this context of we don't outrank one another. We're both children of the King in the kingdom. We have different skills, different giftings, and we need to present those all to Jesus. It's a warning to all of us. I think where we also get kind of askew or get misdirected with this passage is we start reading it and we pick and choose what we like, which is always a big issue. See, wives should submit, easy peasy, right? We jump over the rest of it, and we actually forget where the passage begins. In most of your Bibles, you have a cutoff, and it starts with there's like passage, and then it stops, and then the next passage starts at verse 22. And so you think that's a break in thought, as if they're unrelated, but they're not. And I think that the way that is written in our Bibles was not how Paul wrote it. He didn't have chapter numbers and verse numbers and little subheadings for passages. Those are new, and they're helpful, but sometimes they're misleading. If we go back to verse 15, I'm going to just it's an abbreviation of 15 through 21. It says, "Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise but as wise, making the best use of the time, because the days are evil. Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is." Jumping to verse 20. "Giving thanks always and for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." So don't be foolish, don't be unwise. Instead, do this, implying that the opposite of this, submitting to one another, is a foolish thing. These artificial ranks, this power we like to have over each other, that's foolish thinking. That's a foolish society that doesn't work. In the kingdom, there's wisdom, and that wisdom, part of one thing it looks like is this, being mutually submissive to one another. So submit to one another. Why do we do this? Out of reverence for Christ. So remember, no matter how much of a big shot you think you are outside these doors, inside these doors, and actually outside these doors, you're all under Jesus. So you're not that big of a deal. Remember that, right? It's important to kind of have this balance of, like, I am a child of the King, but there's a huge gap between us, right? And so I might be very, very important in the kingdom of God, but so is she. And so is she, and so is he. And we're all on equal footing in this. And we do this, we mutually submit to one another. We submit one to another. Why? Because of who Christ is and what Christ did. Then last week I talked about another story or passage from Matthew 10:37. And this is where he says, "Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son," and this is phileo, "whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, who loves son or daughter more than me." This is not saying that we should not love our family. This is just saying we need to have them in the right order, which is a little bit of what Paul's getting at in this Ephesians passage and the Galatians passage I references, keeping things in the right order and at the right level. We need to remember that we're on equal footing, and part of how we love each other is we submit to each other. Why? Because of what Christ did for each one of us, for me and for her.
Yeah. So we're going to talk a little bit about the connections as we wrap up today between Jacob and Rachel and just this passage that Jake just unpacked for us. But there's a lot of stories about love in the Bible. I mean, the whole Bible is a giant love story. And one thing that I have learned about love as I've been we've been married almost 28? Yeah.
Yes.
I round up. Like, am I 52 or am I 53? I don't know.
So in her mind, we've been almost 28 for about 6 months, which means we're already 28, getting 29, so it gets very confused. But I love it, and I submit to it.
But we've learned some things along the way, and a lot of it is stuff like we've been talking about sacrifice, the kind of sacrifice Jacob did for Rachel, the kind of submission and deferring to one another that we see in Ephesians, and then that godly order that God gives us that helps all of our love relationships. And I know there's some in this room that are in the middle of an Eros relationship, and it's complicated. It is complicated. I think that Facebook status is pretty accurate. It can be complicated. I also think that there are people in this room who long to have this kind of relationship. And so if you're not at a place yet where you are in an Eros relationship, I hope that you can learn some things just from this. Because it takes a lifetime often to learn these things. And I know I've been married for almost 28 years, and I'm still learning. And if there's anything that I'm very aware of, it's that there's so much more to learn. But what I have learned in the last 28 years is, that whole Jerry Maguire thing of "you complete me," that really there's only one that completes me, and that's Jesus Christ. And my feeling of wanting to be adored and treasured, Jake does. I mean, he adds to my life for sure. We'd be lost without each other. Mm-hmm. And he does adore me, and he treasures me. But I realized about 5 years into marriage, like Jake, there's still lack within me. Like, why do I still feel needy? And I realized it's because the ultimate fulfillment of all those things really is Christ. And that I love my best. I can love better when I understand that my ultimate source is Jesus. And that fulfillment ultimately comes from him. And that's something that becomes more and more solidified in my heart and mind as the years go on. So that's one thing I've learned through these last 28 years. What have you learned, honey?
I think that mutual submission thing was just complicated, especially as we started to kind of grow our family, and I was always a little bit more career-minded. She never had specific career goals. She wanted to do meaningful work, but as long as it was meaningful and you liked who you worked with, that was fine. And which made you great prey for managers who thought, well, as long as I keep her happy, I don't have to pay her very well. So there's a dark side to that. But I had aspirations. The other kind of side plot was you had grown up moving a lot and lived in some really cool places. And I was born in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I think when I was around 4, we moved up to Charlevoix, which is up here. You've seen this map. So from down about here to here. Maddie is from over here. And then we didn't move. Really. We stayed in this small town, which was great. It's a beautiful town. And we didn't travel a whole lot. And so I was like anxious to see new things. So we get married. I'm like, let's move here. That'd be cool for a couple of years. And she's looking for roots. Because I knew my grandparents, visited them a lot. She didn't grow up with her grandparents, and she wanted our kids to know her grandparents. I'm like, they'll be fine, whatever. I wanted to see new places, and so we had that piece. And then I was kind of growing my career in higher education and looking for opportunities for growth and whatever. And so that was a tension point, like who wins, right? Whose preference is the most important? And as we talk to young couples, especially as we're heading into wedding season, we're doing some premarital counseling with people, that's one thing that kind of comes up is, like, how do we decide where we're going to live, and whose career is the most important, which is going to guide, and how do we do that? And that was hard for me as I'm trying to figure out, okay, what's my role as a husband? Who wins, right? What's the most important thing? And among several important things, so how do you rank that? And there were definitely some, I think part of why those first 5 years, it wasn't simply that you expected too much from me. I think they were just rough years. So there's that. But learning to find a way to find a solution that is best for us. And we've said to some of you that if we were single or if we were just the decision maker, we would have made different decisions throughout our lives, or even now. Like, there's things that we would do differently. But the better we get at this, at submitting to one another, the more we appreciate each other's strengths, and I think the better we are in differences, and the better we are together. And so I think sometimes you get to see, hopefully, us working well together, but that's been hard fought over a lot of years because, as Michelle said at the beginning, mic drop, we're very different people. Like, I don't know if you picked up on that, but we are. And so, you love my sarcasm. Just kidding, she doesn't. But that's not going away. So trying to figure each other out and appreciate each other more fully. And I think that got the pace of that growth accelerated once we began to kind of really put the other first.
Yeah. So we've said a lot of words, so we wanted to give you just 3 things to take away. If you haven't been listening, start listening right now. From Jacob and Rachel.
So Jeff, turn it up a little bit.
From Jacob and Rachel, sacrifice for one another. It's worth it. It's hard, but do it. And this is, again, something we're still our marriage is far beyond perfect. I mean, it just is. And I'm not embarrassed by that because we're just in process. And so this year, people have asked me, what's your New Year's resolution? And the only thing I really decided was I wanted to be nicer to Jake. Not that he's like, I'm cruel. I just was like, I want to sacrifice more for him. You guys, I got up and made him breakfast the other day.
It's huge.
So, sacrifice for one another.
I've got all kinds of jokes I'm not going to make. I'm so grown up. The other from Ephesians, we submit to one another. We submit to one another. So we sacrifice for each other and we submit to one another. How can I defer to you? How can I defer to you for your good? And the other from the Matthew is we put things, from the passage of Matthew, we put things in the right place. When I became a Christian, and those of us who were Christians in the 80s and early 90s, we talked a lot about like idols and making sure that, none of us most of us, I don't think, have a statue that we are worshiping sometimes, but we have things that can take too much priority. So then there's all this language, like what's an idol and how do we avoid that and all that stuff. And so then times it took some real extremes, like you can't really love anything. Jesus isn't saying don't love other things. He gives us this world to enjoy and each other to enjoy, but they have to be in the right order. And when they're in the right order, we're more likely to love those things well and appreciate those things. And they don't become a dark or a drag or a detriment to our lives. They add to our lives. So sacrificing for each other, submitting to one another, and loving Jesus and loving the things we love in the right order helps us to do this better.
So today was more conversational, and we want to continue the conversation. 50% of all marriages end in divorce. And sometimes I think that, I feel really lucky and blessed that we are still together, and so many precious people that we know, divorce has been their story. And so this is hard. This is hard for people. And so we need each other in this. Like Jake spoke this week into our group, God speaks to us through our community. And so we want to make this a regular conversation for our community, for those who are healing from painful love situations. I know we have friends in here who have been hurt, who've been betrayed, and maybe are afraid to love again. I know we have friends in here who right now, maybe you're just like in the honeymoon season, and we celebrate that with you. That's awesome. We know we also have friends in here who are longing for these kinds of relationships. Or maybe you're just stuck. Maybe you're just bored in your loving relationship. It is complicated. And so one of the things we're going to do as a church is quarterly we're going to have just the time set apart to have conversation and encouragement. And Josie mentioned it earlier. It's going to be, it's starting this Saturday, and it's for all couples, married, premarital, or a couple that's in a serious dating relationship. We want to make it available so that we can, I think, also being with one another who are in different stages of relationship, that's good for us. It's an encouragement. And so just think about that. We'd love for you to join us this Saturday. But this is an important part of our life. This is an important part of our heart. And like Jake said, team, if you want to come on up for worship. Like Jake and I both have said, the ultimate fulfillment of these needs being met in our life are met by Christ. And from that place, we love better. But we have to be intentional about keeping Christ as our first love. And so today, just as we wrap up, I just want you, whatever love story you desire or you're in the middle of, like we've said before, just put it at his feet. Just put it at his feet. He'll speak to you. He'll tell you. He'll show you. If your heart has been hurt by a love story, if your love story didn't turn out the way that you wanted it to, you know what? Put it at his feet. He'll bring you the comfort you need. And look to him as your first love, because he is the best love. And from that place, he allows and equips us to live lives that are so loving and full and healed. And so today, as we close, I just ask that you, in all vulnerability with him and you, just place that before him.